Oh, hi, everyone. I am thrilled to introduce Phyllis, who is a new friend of mine, relatively speaking. Um, I just moved a year ago, moved into Adams Station where my son was working. He said, "Oh my gosh, you've got to meet this Phyllis. She knows so much about history and her family history and genealogy." And sure enough, as soon as we met at a gathering, we were off talking, and we can never really get to the end of it. So I started to read her books. The first one was The Fires of Europe. And then the second one, I was working on it, and it's called wait a minute, Phyllis,
Plowshares.
Plowshares. Yeah, Plowshares. I said, oh, the Plowshares of the blah, blah, blah. And I totally misstated it. And she said the Palatinate. And I said, oh, and she goes, I wanted to use that word because it really gets people thinking and learning. And I was like, it's so true. And then I realized, speaking of thinking and learning, that the Palatinate, the people that came from the Palatinate, there was some connection to Albany Pine Bush. And I said, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So that's how I thought of having her on as a speaker. She was born in the Adirondacks, which I think is very exciting, but has lived all over the place. And through her travel, she has gotten caught up in researching her family history, which she'll tell us a bit about tonight. So I won't go into that. But she's done numerous talks on this. Again, she's on her third book of a very gripping story about a young family and some harrowing activities. So she's even spoken on national radio. So I'm very pleased to have her here tonight. And without further ado, Phyllis, take it away.
Okay, thank you. When Kat asked me to talk and see if I could relate it to the pine bush, I said, "Oh, I'm not sure if I can do that, even though there are Palatines that are living all over this section of the state." So I pulled out some of my research books, and when I started reading, I found an amazing connection to the pine bush. I had no idea, so I learned something too. And for additional inspiration, my daughter and I took a day off the other day and we went there. And she said to me, it must be just the way it was when they were here, which was 300 years ago. So not much has changed. But I'll start in with my story, and you'll forgive me if I look at some notes. As I said, I would have liked a little more time to prepare. Not Pat's fault. It's just been a very, very busy month. So, starting off in the first decade of the 18th century, the Archbishop of Canterbury sent out an urgent message across the globe to all of the English colonies saying, can you take some of these refugees? We're just being overrun with them here in England. So he sent um, out to Australia and the United States, all over across the globe. And everyone wanted to know, who were these people? How did they get there? Why are they here? It's kind of a strange story. So what happened was, as we were going through the Reformation, Martin Luther, Henry VIII, and a lot of people played their parts. We had um, Richelieu driving the Protestants out of France. It was a time of total global upheaval. Um, a lot of the French people went across the border and they went into the Falkland or the Palatinate. They were later called Germans, but because a lot of their requests for help were in French, you could see that they had not lost their background. They lived peacefully for a long time. So I'm going to go on to the next screen. And very peacefully, they lived in Germany. There were actually two Palatinate areas, but for our purposes, we can just assume they were, scattered along the Rhine River Valley. So you could see they would go from France, from all of the different countries, from Belgium into Germany. And the draw with Germany at the time was that they had very low taxes. No one would bother them. They could do whatever they want as long as they paid their taxes and everything was good. But then a time came when there was a very harsh winter. The taxes were higher, and the French monarch, Louis the 14th, decided that he was not going to let the middle class just leave France. So he sent his soldiers across the border to harass these people, to kill them, whatever, because he took it personally. So moving from Germany, they escaped up the Rhine River to try and get to the Netherlands. There were a lot of issues along the way. They were charged high fees. They were thrown in jail. But they did make it to the Netherlands, and they went to Rotterdam. This was a safe haven, and they had heard that there was land possibly in America. So they were still trying to figure out what they were going to do with themselves. England's Queen Anne was the queen at the time. She was the sister of um, King of Queen Mary and her husband King William of William and Mary fame. You're familiar with them. And the entire family was really invested in trying to help the Protestants. But Anne had a lot of her own personal problems, a very, very sad life. So she poured her energies into helping these people. They were they were in Rotterdam, and Anne was afraid that these people were going to go to the colonies under the Dutch rule. And you have to realize at the time, 35 years before this, the English had lost New York back to the Dutch. The English conquered the Dutch, but then the Dutch took back control of New York State for a year. And Anne was a little bit worried that all of these refugees were going to threaten their interest in the colony. So there was that. She also had some other things that she was interested in. She was interested in colonial development, and there were people who were after these refugees too. They seemed to be very strong, laborious, satisfied, and industrious people, as well as pretty educated. There were a good number of teachers, carpenters, physicians, surgeons, textile workers, as well as fine dressers. So they thought that they might be a good labor force to send somewhere. English transports decided that they would bring them to London, and the English were fighting the French in the War of the Spanish Succession, so they had ships in the area, and they started transporting them to London, since many of them did want to go to the colonies anyway. Oh, and in London, there's a woodcut here, which shows that their conditions were pretty bad. In Blackheath in London, it was a tent city, and at first it was a sideshow. All of the locals would come and just bring a lunch and watch them on a Sunday and say, "Look at this! Isn't this something?" She had them staying there until they could decide what to do, and it was at this point that the Archbishop sent out his plea for help. So, as I said, they sent some to Australia, Ireland, Barbados, Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. Some of them went to New Falls, of course. And there were also orphans that were coming. Those were apprenticed out. And 16 families were sent to Jamaica as slaves. After a time, they said, we seem to be getting all of Germany in here. They couldn't keep up with taking care of them. They couldn't get them out fast enough. So they were not sure what they were going to do. And soon there were hostilities between the local population too. There were fights that broke out. They felt that these refugees were taking their jobs. They had a lot of the complaints that we hear about today, interestingly enough. And they said that they wanted to go to America. They had heard that there was free land being offered, and in fact, one of the governors of Carolina went in while they were in Rotterdam handing out money. You can imagine if he was just giving money to these people and telling them that there was land available. So this is what they were looking for, and they were ready. So they said, okay, we will do that. We will get some ships together and we'll send people to New York. It was the largest colonial migration, with 3,000 going to New York City with the new governor Lovelace. They camped for the winter on Governor's Island. 446 of them died, 30 were born, and thousands more arrived later. The illness was so bad, there was a lot of typhus on the ship. The illness was so bad that later on they would call typhus Palatine fever. The new governor that traveled with them wasn't too lucky. He only lived about 3 months after he arrived. They said he never had a healthy day at all while he was governor of New York. So Anne had three real dilemmas. She did have a little bit of a shortage of labor, but her biggest problems were all of these refugees coming in. There were French and Indian attacks on the English colonies in North America, but the biggest problem was King Christina, and she was a woman, but she insisted that she be called king. She had a monopoly on the naval stores, especially tar. So there was no tar or pitch available, and it was necessary for repair and waterproofing the ships. Uh, King Christina had high prices. She had restrictive ideas of how they could get it. You could only use Swedish ships, and you could only use Swedish goods. And then eventually she just cut them off altogether. She was allied with England's enemy, France, and so she really didn't care if England could never get enough supplies, these naval stores together, to continue with trade, with their navy. So this was a problem. It was suggested that maybe they send a bunch of Scotsmen into Nova Scotia and French Canada, and they could either take theirs by force or by negotiation, but they decided that wasn't a very good idea. Edward Randolph, who was Surveyor General of Customs in America, observed that a very large supply of tar was being exported from near Albany. And they said they wanted to find out where this was coming from, what this was. They said it probably wasn't the right time. They probably said there was not enough. So they sent someone in to take a look for it, take a look at it. And what they found was that there was plenty of it, and it was exactly what they needed. Pinus rigida, I believe, and it stretched all the way from Hudson Valley to Lake George. And I can personally tell you that it stretches even north of Lake George because I have seen the pine forest up there too. So Queen Anne has all these people over there, and we're going to see what we can do with them. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Robert Livingston, in partnership with New York Governor Hunter, sold land for the Palatine settlement and the Naval Stores Project. He was Commissioner of Indian Affairs and also a land speculator. So that was probably very helpful since there was a lot of confusion as to how much land he actually owned and how much was actually sold to him. And there were some allegations that he sold double of what he actually owned. But this land was set aside. They had funds sent from the British Crown for food, shelter, supplies, and everything else. So all of their needs were taken care of, and the Palatines were moved to Livingston's area that he had sold to the governor. And after they had worked for a certain amount of time, after they had produced enough tar, they could pay back the debt because they were being charged for their food and their living quarters and everything else, their equipment. They signed a contract saying that after these were paid back, they would be given 40 acres at Schoharie. And Schoharie became the magic land, the promised land. So all they talked about was going to Schoharie. This is the land you can see um, down here at the very bottom right hand. There's Livingston Manor. He was a very modest and unassuming man, naming his land his manor. And there's also Van Rensselaer's land. And if you look on here, you can also see the Palatine areas. You can see some other maps on there, some other areas that are, I think, are very interesting. And the spellings are interesting too. Unfortunately, the project was just about to get rolling when they got a new king. Unfortunately, Queen Anne passed away, and the new king, who had a German background, did not really see the value of having all this money wasted on people in a colony that was so far away. He completely cut off funds for the project. So on September 12th, 1712, they got word that they were not going to get any more food. They were not going to get any more help. Winter was coming on, and they really didn't know what they were going to do. It was suggested the governor couldn't help them either. He hadn't been paid in a long time either. So he said, well, what you can do is you can hire yourselves out, but you do need to get permission and let us know where you're going, and you need to stand by so that we can resume this work. And it was making the tar out of the pine trees. And at that point, 50 families refused to wait. They cut the road from Schenectady to Schoharie, which was their promised land, where you see the plaque, mentioning the Palatines going there. And the Indians helped them through the winter. The Iroquois and Indians of that area had very good relations with the people. And so they helped them through the winter. And then in the spring, 150 other families followed. The Governor Hunter, said he feared that the Schoharie Palatines would not return to the vast pine woods near to Albany. And this was his great regret on that. And the English monarch's refusal to continue the project probably was what saved the pine bush, because it probably would have been completely used up, taken out. They had moved, even though they had done this for a living and they had people who were helping them and knew what they were doing. They were very happy with their land in Schoharie. They didn't feel that they wanted to make any of these stores anymore. And lawsuits and land battles continued, but this is what probably saved the pine bush and kept it the way it is, the way we have it today. And people in central New York may not know that their background, they may be interested in finding their genealogical history, but they may be wondering what those names that have French sounding names or different names that sound German, where they came from. So today, it seems like the pine bush has been preserved, and it looks like it would have when they were there. Um, and it was seen as a great resource for financial gain. They thought they could take every pine tree out of the state and make a lot of money, at least for the crown, supply them with enough tar. But now we really have come to value it as a different kind of a resource that shows us the natural beauty and also a little bit of history. So that's pretty much everything I had. Does anyone have any questions for me or?
Yes, Phyllis.
Yes.
How did they get tar from the balsam sap from the trees?
Well, that was a little bit of a complicated situation. Apparently, they had to strip the trunks of the trees while they were living. They were supposed to stand, I believe, over the winter, over a couple of months. And they didn't go into the process very much, but they were very upset that these people were leaving. They said, "We've already stripped down the trees, we've readied them, they've been sitting there, and now you're going to stop the project. They're ready." And from that point, I believe they probably take the sap and boil it down. But I would have to study that a little bit more. I'm not an expert on that by any means. This was just what I picked up. And I would like to mention that most of my information came from early 18th century Palatine migration by Walter Allen Middle. And it's a treasure trove. It's a very old book, and it has a lot of information. It even has lists of the passengers. They kept meticulous lists of them, and also from Henry
Can you
Z.
repeat that?
Jones. I'm sorry, Henry Z. Jones, who talked about the Palatines. I got the opportunity to meet him, and that's about all I can say about making it. I probably should dig a little bit deeper into that. I'm always fascinated to know how they did things and exactly all of the information. Anyone else?
Yeah, Phyllis?
Yes.
Yeah, Scott. While you were talking and showing the map, I Googled I looked on Google Maps and I knew the name sounded familiar, Palatine, and I see the village of Palatine Bridge and the town of Palatine.
Yes.
So that's the area that they settled, I guess, or?
Yes, absolutely. And there are a lot of very German sounding names that you might see over there too. A lot of the settlements are no longer there, but there are other ones. And there was a German town.
German Flats. Yep.
Right?
That was founded by my family, actually.
Ah, are you a Palatine? Are you?
I am. It comes full circle, I guess, because I'm a Pine Bush naturalist, and I love walking around in the Pine Bush and feel connection there. And apparently, that's because, yeah, I'm a Palatine. I'm Dutch. My fourth great grandmother, who like founded gave the land. She actually got land in the Burnettsfield patent that you're talking about, like the land that Queen Anne gave, that they gave to them.
Yeah.
Her husband died on the way over on the boat, or in the travels to get to Herkimer. And she gave the land. Yeah, they gave that land. So, but it was on the other side of the river. Like, there are some confusing things. I've learned a lot about that area, but it's kind of cool now to know that they may have come through the pine bush, come way of the pine bush. So that's probably why I like it there so much too. It's kind of cool. But yeah, there's a great lot of history. Can you just repeat that book that you said you used?
Sure.
Please.
Let's see. Early 18th century Palatine Migration by Walter Allen Middle, and that's Knittle. And I would highly recommend anything by Henry Z. Jones. He's done a bunch of things, and as I said, I was so fortunate to meet him and be able to talk with him. There are very large Palatine settlements down in Mannequin, Virginia, South Carolina they went to, and of course Palatine, Illinois is fairly famous, and a large number of them went to Pennsylvania as well.
Yeah.
Apparently William Penn was really in there trying to get a lot of them to come and settle. It was very difficult for me to try and boil everything down. I was telling Kat I had about 10 pages, and I said, no, I'm going over 400 years and over all these pages. I need to boil it down. So you're familiar with some of it. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the stories that came down through my family, that now that I've done genealogy and history and listened to, people like you who've studied it, they always said, like, my, again, this fourth great grandmother was friends with Queen Anne. And that is how, like, she got the land, and, I mean, now the history of it, and I have paperwork on it. I know exactly what land they had and everything, which is kind of neat to know. But the story of my family was that we were friends with royalty, which
Yes.
Austin, a whole lot of other, totally abused. They had no idea of like what our family went through until, books like Drums Along the Mohawk and things like that really shed a light on the war stuff. But I mean, just being like, Pine Bush was frontier. And then they went even farther, to like Schoharie was just wild country, which is crazy to think about.
Well, they called it the Western Frontier, Schoharie. And Queen Anne had, there's always a little bit of truth in there. And I was always wondering about Queen Anne because I remember Queen Anne's war with the French and Indians. Mm-hmm. And then Queen Anne's lace, I wondered why they named it that. And it seemed that she was very good at it, but she had a very, very sad life. She was in love with her husband, and he was in love with her passionately. And this was such a rare thing. She had 18 miscarriages. And so she poured all of her energies into trying to save other people. It seemed like she had a short, and she was always in her sister's shadow. William and Mary were probably much better known than Queen Anne. The only thing we remember about Anne is her war or her Queen Anne's lace. So she may have, made friendly gestures that your ancestors appreciated.
Yeah, I think they thought of her as a friend and an ally, even though they didn't maybe know her personally, but they thought of her that way, for sure.
Well, there were a lot of bad experiences with a lot of the European monarchs. So when you found a friendly one, it was like finding a best friend, I guess. Especially someone with financial help.
Like you said, I know a lot of my ancestors I've traced back to like Switzerland and Alsace.
Yes.
And that's where they started basically their great migration, if you want to call it that. And there always has been confusion in my family, like our name, the Petrie name is a big name, and there's Dutch Petrie and there's German Petrie. So you have to figure out which, and I think some of it was like just mixed up because they thought we were Dutch, but it was just because we left from the Netherlands. Like that's where they came from, but that's not really where they were from. And again, they didn't know the story back then. So they just knew they were Dutch. They considered themselves Dutch, and we were actually German. Most of, I mean, I have some Dutch too, but mostly German, which is kind of neat. Yeah. It's a really cool, migration story, religion story.
And the Belgians really confused things.
I'd like to recommend this book called Becoming German, which is totally dedicated to your subject.
Yes, very good book. Very good. It's new, isn't it? Or is there a new version?
No, I
thought it was like a new version.
Years ago. But it is totally dedicated to this subject and goes into a lot of detail in addition to what you've covered here.
And who's the author?
Philip Otternes, Otterness. And it's a fabulous book. You don't have to be related to the Palatines to enjoy this book. But my wife Nan is a descendant of these Palatines, and we live literally on the Pine Bush at the what's our trailhead?
Blueberry West
trailhead, and we moved there not knowing the connection between her ancestors and the Pine Bush until today. This is not particularly emphasized in this book, although there's a tremendous amount of detail in this book.
It's interesting how that happens. We're drawn to these places that our ancestors were. I find that over and over.
It's a whole subject in itself.
Mhm.
Well, it's interesting to me how like the genealogy of it ties in with the geology of it, the, you know, the history itself. And I do think like most of us are distantly related, especially those of us who've lived in this area and families have been in this area all of our, you know, many generations.
Mhm.
I hear names now and I, you know, I know they're in my, like somewhere in my genealogy, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm always like, I think we're related. Like, I feel like I'm related to everybody that I, you know, come in contact with. So I might be related to your wife, Nan, you know, who knows?
Who knows?
I think one of the aspects of the story that interested me was that these Palatines had heard such good things about the Mohawk Indians. And they hated the British because of the way they had been treated. They hated the French because of what had happened in Europe. And so they were very, very favorable to being in a relationship with the Mohawks, and they approached them, and that's how they got permission to occupy land in and around Schoharie. It was from the Mohawks that they got
Oh, no.
their land.
William Johnson went in and he really did a sales job, and so he really won over the Mohawks and the Confederacy. And you have to remember that early on, Samuel de Champlain got in with the Algonquin Indians, the Abenaki, and the other people. And so very early on, the French and the Indians were against the British and later Americans and the Mohawk. I found that the book, The Matchlock Gun, which I had forgotten, I read it years ago. My daughter reminded me, she said, Mom, I know that book. You read that book to me. And it's very good because it was written for children, but it's 50 pages. Walter Edmonds wrote it, and he wrote Guns Along the Mohawk. But the detail he has in there, like he mentions that the mother is on the lookout for the St. Francis Indians. And most people just gloss over that. But the St. Francis Indians are the Abenaki. They're the Algonquin Indians, and not the Mohawks that were here in the Albany area and west.
Right. And the Mohawks didn't necessarily get along, like all the Indians didn't get along either.
They were
So we
enemies.
make alliances with some of them, you know, in hopes of keeping the more vicious ones away. Although I have relatives too who were scalped and lived, you know, to see the pictures of their face. Like, it's just incredible. And the relationship with the Indians. Now I thought you said something about the Iroquois. Oh, the Indians that helped them. You said the Iroquois.
The Iroquois and Confederacy. So that was the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk.
Okay,
and
so
the
it's like
Tuscarora were included in there until they went south.
Okay.
The Algonquins were the Abenaki, Penobscot, the people that you find in Connecticut.
the eastern ones. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I had
Yeah,
a
that's always
relative.
confusing. You know, the Iroquois, you think it's like the Iroquois Indians are just themselves, but they were a whole bunch of different tribes. It wasn't like,
They say there were thousands of different languages at the time, and just as the colonists were arriving, the Iroquois had conquered the Algonquin peoples, and they shoved them back to the east side of the Hudson River. And they even made some of them slaves. So, you know, there was a lot of animosity. They didn't speak the same language. They were totally different people.
And just on a prior subject, this book says that they were not successful in extracting the tar from the trees themselves, that the only source that they were successful in getting the tar from were the pine cones that were collected by the children.
Ah, interesting. I'll have to look into that. I'm sure they put the children to work too. You know, if they could walk and they could speak, they could work. They were put to work.
Right.
they didn't have any babysitters. They had to bring them with them.
Well, in fact, let's see, there was, who was it? John Peter Zinger. He fought for freedom of the press. He was one of the orphans that they apprenticed out when they got to New York City.
Oh, wow.
And that was very interesting to me. I said, I know that name. I've heard that name. And he arrived an orphan and he ended up fairly famous.
Now, so that's a question because I'm under the impression, and again, it's hard for me because I get confused because I have Dutch from like, you know, Manhattan and.
Well, you and I are definitely cousins. We're definitely
Yeah,
related.
we must be.
I tell people I'm the history of colonial America in one package.
I'm telling you, like, sometimes people are like, there's no way. They're like, oh yeah, like you founded everything. You know, it's like, well, sorry, but you know, that's just, I can't help it. But I can't remember where I was going with that, but I lost my train of thought. But anyway, it's just, it'll come back to me.
Well, there were a lot of orphans and they did all kinds of things. They were sent out, and I had an ancestor that was sent out. They would apprentice them out for, you know, 8 years, 18 years, and it was like slavery. And, you know, some of them did pretty well and others not so much. But I also had an ancestor who was captured by the Indians, and she fairly famously scalped the Indians and escaped. And I always say, all was forgiven within another generation. There were Indian in-laws. So.
Well, that's true. That's true. And that I was, you know, interested to see if I had any Indian in me, but I don't. But I thought that would have been kind of cool because I'm sure there was, you know, just like anything, there was a lot of commingling of the Indians and the whites too. So
one of the interesting things was that one of the leaders of the Palatine placed his son with the Mohawks.
Yes, and that was in the story too.
When they grew up, they had tremendous starvation. They boiled grass. They had the children eating leaves.
Yes,
and the
yes,
death rate was so high that the widows married widowers and then raised the orphans. It was a desperate situation.
Yeah, it was not, it was not a picnic. They're strong people, that's for sure.
Phyllis, what year did the 3,000 come to New York City?
Let's see. They arrived, it was, I believe, 1710.
Right.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. That's what it reminded me. So did they come? I was under the impression that the German Palatines came through like Boston and Massachusetts way. I had like this trail of, you know, ancestors kind of through Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but the Rhode Island people were English, so I don't think it's them.
Well,
but
they did send them
they
all
come
over.
through New York?
They did send them all over, so it wasn't just the 300 that landed in New York. They were sent to Boston, to
Mine went to
South
Virginia.
Carolina, anywhere where they could find. Can you take 10 of them? Okay, can you take 15 of them?
Right.
So they probably did go through Boston also. They probably did go through other places. So your family may not have been the ones that were camping on Governor's Island. They may luckily found some place that was a better place to spend the winter.
Bob, what did you say you had?
Mine went to Virginia, near Richmond.
Richmond, yeah. Mannequin is a very famous. Have you been to Mannequin?
No.
Oh, it's a very famous Palatine settlement. It is a wonderful little town. They've got terrific history, and I would highly, highly recommend it if you just want to take a little.
I've been down to Richmond once, but that was it.
Yeah, I used to go there a lot for research.
My Palatine ancestors went to Lunenburg, Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
They were settled there after the British cleared out the French and were looking to populate the empty spaces and brought over Palatines for that. So Nan and I have two different Palatine origins. But Phyllis, could I ask one more thing? Could
Sure.
you explain to me, well, you probably did in the talk, but did these Palatines actually live in the pine bush? My understanding was that they came through here, but that was after the stores project had sort of flopped. I didn't have any sense of them having carried on the TARS thing in the pine bush itself. I thought all that was south in Livingston.
That's exactly what I read out of the book. And the only thing that I have is the governor saying regretfully that now we'll never get them to come to Albany. You know, he was sort of eyeing the pine lands around Albany. But when it flopped down south of there, as you say, and they all headed out to Schoharie, and a good number of them kept going to Pennsylvania. So I don't think that they ever did get a chance to really take everything out of the pine bush here, which is good for us. We still have that land, and I don't think there's that much left down, you know, over, it would be in the Rhine Cliff area. Rhinebeck, if you're familiar with that, on the other side of Kingston, the other side of the Hudson River.
So what is the connection to the pine bush again?
To the pine bush with the Palatines.
Yeah.
They were brought over for the purpose of getting tar
Yeah,
and naval stores.
right.
So Livingston said, well, I've got some land I can sell you, which was down there.
Right.
And they said, oh, this land goes all the way from New York City up to Lake George. We can just have them work the whole thing. We'll take every pine tree out of the state of New York. It'll be great. And the Queen will have an unending supply and we'll never have to worry about Sweden again. But they never got that far.
So
I
did
think
they get to the pine bush or not? I'm
they
confused.
did not, I don't think. I do not see any
Okay.
evidence that they ever got there, although they were eyeing it and thinking they were going to send them to Albany at first. And they said, there's no land in Albany. We can't give them any farmland, and these people want farmland. We'll just promise them Schoharie, and they'll be in so much debt that they'll never get there anyway. But we'll just have them work all of the pine fields, the pine trees. So that's what it sounded like, that they were going to be indentured for the rest of their lives and never ever make it to Schoharie. But they decided they'd had enough and they were going, and they settled on the lands in Schoharie, and there were huge fights with that too. And it really got ugly. People beating each other up and killing each other over the land, whether they had ownership of it. But they did not return to Albany to work for the naval stores. As far as I can tell, I've never seen it.
So has anybody had the misfortune of parking their car underneath pine trees on a hot summer day?
Oh, many, many times.
And today I spent about an hour using some substance that I bought at Pep Boys, trying to get that
Wow.
pitch off of my vehicle, and it is hard as glass. So
Actually,
I can very well understand how they use the pine tar as a sealant on ships.
Actually, you can try to use isopropyl alcohol really on a sponge, and it just
That's what I use.
dissolves.
You got to use it regularly every day. If it stays on for 2 or 3 days, you can't get it off.
Phyllis, what about that historical marker, the blue and gold one that mentions the Palatines that's in the Schenectady brochure I sent you?
Yeah, I couldn't find that. It just had a mention of them, and it mentions that they built a road. Is that right? That was the one I was trying to find.
The King Highway.
Oh, didn't you? I was going to pull it up.
They did not mention that they were building that road with no food and eating leaves and it in fall with the winter coming on. I think that's a significant part of the story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so the for those that haven't seen it, there's one of those historical markers that says Palatine Road circa 1712, first road west by German refugees to Schoharie Valley.
1712, that was the year.
Mhm. Yep.
And where's the sign?
That's the year my grandmother got the patent, 1712.
Now, Phyllis, I live in Altamont, the village of Altamont, and the Schoharie Plank Road was the Palatine Road originally. And it passed through Altamont on through the various couple of valleys to, like, I think Gallopville and then Schoharie. Now,
Is
I'm
it
wondering.
Route 20 maybe? Like Route 20, isn't it?
No,
Going
no,
west?
no. Now, my question, let me finish my question. Did the Palatines make the road, or did they clear the vegetation and put logs down to make the corduroy type road, or was that several generations later and other people?
I would be inclined to think it was several generations later, because we have to remember at this time there were no roads. There weren't any streets really. Most of the travel was done by water, which is why you see them going, the towns and villages growing up the Hudson and out the Mohawk. There was just no way to get through. Some of it was open because the Indians did burn some of it. They wanted the pasture land, so they would set fires occasionally. But the corduroy road came later, and then the macadam. And I learned that in Virginia, and they thought it was a terrible eccentricity that George Washington owned a carriage when there weren't any roads really. I mean, maybe a couple roads. So, and I'm thinking, wow, that's late in the 1700s, So they were still very short of roads. They chopped down a bunch of trees so they could get anything, a cart through the woods or a bunch of people walking. They did have animal trails, and they had Indian trails that they followed. But if they wanted anything wider, or going to where they wanted to go and not just follow the trail, then they would have to cut it themselves, mark it anyway.
I put something in the chat that's the links to the first one is the link to our history and culture page, and the second one is a link to that brochure that shows the Palatine historical plaque. And what it says on our webpage is, over time, trading posts grew into cities and footpaths, which were widened into roadways, including the historic King's Highway. For a brochure on the history of this highway, click here, which is the link, and Palatine Road.
Do they have the years, Kat, when the roads were widened? And
it doesn't. Well, it says with the arrival of the Dutch explorers in the 1600s.
okay.
Right.
So,
I would look up Truax, because that spot right there on King's Highway in the Pine Bush, where the Truax family was. They had some kind of a tavern or something there, I think.
They are mentioned.
And I wonder when that was, like what year that was, but that was that same area.
They're mentioned in the Huguenot history and also the Palatines, because they were some of the people that came out of France and went through the Palatinate and then came over. They have an interesting history too. I've read some of their interesting history.
Mm-hmm.
So Phyllis, did some of the Schoharie Palatinates continue on to Herkimer?
Yes, and Herkimer himself, I believe it was the father of General Herkimer, was one of the Palatines.
Yeah, Johann Jost Herkimer.
That's a good German name.
Yeah, and then there's Johann Jost Petrie. That was my.
Oh, okay.
But he was not the woman, my fourth great grandmother. It's her son, because the other Johann Jost, like I said, he died on the way over. But that was in, like I say, 1723. They're talking 17 by 1723. Right. They're like
Yes.
settled, you know, basically as far as Herkimer. Like
Right.
it wasn't
There's
called
a very
Herkimer.
nice historical marker right on the Empire bike path, in almost facing General Herkimer's mansion. There in as you're just before you enter Little Falls.
Mhm.
And it talks about the Palatinate, just everything that you've spoken about so far, and then it goes on to talk about the 5,000 acres that were purchased around Little Falls, where they also settled.
Yeah, Little Falls and Canajoharie was basically almost impassable. That area too looks nothing like it used to, like it did back then. It was very, very dangerous. They had a mill or something there that, like, again, you know, I read something about a mill, and there was a lot of Indian raids right in that area, because the Indians had all that area, Stone Arabia, and all in that Palatine Bridge, all of that area too was all Indian occupied, basically. And they were becoming Christians.
And the descendants of these Palatines fought the Battle of Oriskany. And 7 of Nan's ancestors fought that battle. 3 died.
Yeah, they talk about the Stone Arabia patent also, and some of the other patents. So they are mentioned in this book, and there's a very long list of passenger lists. So, you know, I would recommend
we'll check it out for sure.
Seeing if you can get it through interlibrary loan.
Yep. The archives at the New York State Library too are a great place. I could sit there for hours and look through all the Palatine stuff that's there. It's really kind of neat.
Yeah, I do genealogy, and I try very hard. I'm pretty strict about it, not to go with my wild fantasies. Those go into my fiction books, you know, then I can mix and match and pull in relatives and do. But when it comes to genealogy, I'm a stickler for actual records. You'd be surprised what you can find in the actual record. I'm always so grateful when there's a lawsuit, because then I can find my relative and I can find a date and I know where they were. So whether someone's suing them or they're getting in a fight with someone else, it's great, because then you can find the facts.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, since she said the crazy stuff goes in her books, again, Phyllis's books are really fun to read, very fast moving, lots of history, and they puts you right there in the middle of it. So as she was talking about the Palatinate and the Netherlands and France, because of her books, I felt like I was right there. And her third book, which I'll get her to say the name of, it's coming out soon, and that's about a family that lived in the Palatinate for a little while, but France and the Netherlands, and they're on the ship coming to America. So if you want to enjoy that, all the experiences they must have gone through as they took that long journey. What's the name of that third book, Phyllis?
Tentatively, Destination Tamaqua Territory. So it's about the beaver trade, and the entire book takes place on the ship coming over. And I spent a lot of hours on replicas of ships and some of the original old ships. And it's just really amazing how dirty and cramped and scary they are. And these people were locked down below for 3 months without seeing daylight. You think we're going crazy now with COVID. I just cannot imagine. And there were people that were killing each other because they were just going crazy from being locked up that long. Not to mention the disease and the food, and you know, but at the same time, you know, there are little things to look forward to, and I like to put a lot of humor in it. You know, sometimes I think I have kind of a twisted sense of humor, because you see the humor even in history, you know, you have to, these people had to have some kind of sense of humor to keep going. I mean, what kept these people going? I probably would have given up in Rotterdam, you know,
Yeah.
but they were tough, and they had their eyes on the future, and they were going to make it, and they
Thank
did.
goodness for our sakes they did.
Yes,
Definitely.
to surprise any of us are here.
Yeah. So I just want to say too, as a little plug for the Daughters of the American Revolution, because again, we were talking about, you know, Oriskany, the Battle of Oriskany, and the Revolutionary War also is another part of that. That genealogy got me understanding a lot more about that and the craziness that was at the time. You know, families fighting families and loyalists, you know, going to Canada, which is why some of them are in Canada. I mean, it's just the history of the whole thing is great. But Johannes Hamer Clock, so the clocks too, he is my DAR guy. And I mean, if you ever, the two, it's just a great group of people. If you're interested in genealogy and your history, or you have any Revolutionary War heroes, they do a lot of great stuff. We're doing the regional food bank actually in a week too. So just a plug for DAR, another like genealogy history group.
Hopefully I can get to that, and I have those relatives too, where there was a story of 4 sons, and the father didn't want them all to die, so sent 2 to fight with the English and 2 to fight with the Americans. And they still have family reunions every year in Canada. So, but they couldn't cross the border this year.
Yeah. So I think that's a cool, you know, thing about like your book is, you know, hear what they went through, see what, you know, the life that they suffered through. But, you know, they say it's only like it takes 4 generations and you need like, you know, 2,000 great grandparents or something. So it doesn't take long for that legacy, you know, just those couple people that hang on and made it, you know, created a huge legacy.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. I really.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
It was awesome.
Very nice talk. Thank you.
Oh,